welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Norman Finkelstein. Today we're going to discuss his magnum opus, Gaza and Inquest into his martyrdom. Norm, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always my pleasure to talk to you.
I wanted to discuss your book, and it's an incredible privilege to discuss it with you. For obviously, on a lighter note, I didn't want to give you a lot of opportunity to shame me that I haven't completed the book. But on a more serious note, I think um, it's a lot of people now know about your book. A lot of people are interested in your book, but some of them might not have the time or energy to go through the book. So I thought it would be a good video archive of a book that you have produced and is so important at this moment. Um, I wanted to kickstart by asking you a little bit to reflect on your title of the book. Because one of the things that struck you began by saying that this is not a book on Gaza, this is a book on what is done to Gaza. So the subject it feels is the perpetrators, Israel, and we can add a bunch of allies and stuff. Um, Halfway through your book, one doesn't get a sense of martyrdom, and it's only when you start discussing the operation Gaslit and Protective Edge, one understands what that martyrdom is. Tell us a little bit about the making of the title.
Well, the title came instinctively, but that's because by the time I titled the book, I had a clear conception in my mind of what the book was about. Now, I'll say as a preliminary remark, one of the referees, the readers of the book for University of California Press, objected to the title. He's a person ostensibly of the left, but he didn't think the word martyrdom should be in the title of a book from a university press. And I wasn't in the least deterred or dissuaded by that remark, because the title is an indication or reflects what I was trying to do in the book. Inquest refers to a very systematic, methodical, tedious a manuscript. I very much doubt many people read it. The last chapters, when I go through the chapters called Betrayal 1 and Betrayal 2, where I analyze the misrepresentations and falsifications in the human rights reporting on Gaza. It's a very detailed, very difficult chapters to read. I don't really write for people. I write for history. I want the record to be there because I don't believe, it may be hubris on my part, but I don't believe maybe no persons have the discipline for detail that I do. And so if I don't go through it point by point, line by line, methodically demonstrating the misrepresentation, I don't believe anybody else will do it. They don't, either because they don't have the patience, the discipline, or because they don't think it's important. I believe it's important. I do believe the devil is in the details. And unless you master the details, you don't really know what's going on. So Inquest refers to that, to the forensic side of the book. But there's another side of the book. There's indignation. There's outrage. There's a lot of disgust at what's been done to those people. They have been martyred. And I don't believe in writing a book that's strictly clinical. You are an economist by training now, and you will recognize the tradition from where I come, which is to say, the tradition beginning with Marx, very rigorous, very methodical, very dry, especially those first chapters of Das Kapital, extremely dry. What is a commodity? And but on the other hand, it is replete with rage, outrage at what's been done to the toiling classes and the whole system of capitalism, which Marx describes as coming into the world with blood and dirt dripping from all its pores. That's not clinical language. That's indignation and that's outrage. And those were from a fairly young age the models for me. The ability to combine the forensic aspect with the moral indignation. So that was what the title attempted to capture. It is an inquest. It's a coroner's report, but it's also, as I said, replete with outrage.
Yeah, that's
Outrage not only at what was done, what has been done to those people. That's only half the outrage. The other half is the lies,
right.
falsifications, the betrayal of the human rights organizations, the cowardice of the human rights organizations. I was struck, this is a side note, but it's not irrelevant. So as you know, and as your viewers no doubt know, the current scandal is how the Israeli Secret Services attempted to blackmail the former chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda. You're aware of that story, correct? Yes, it's all over the place. And I had to say I was bemused and amused when Ken Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, he wrote an article in yesterday's Guardian newspaper celebrating the heroism and the courage of Fatou Bensouda, who did not succumb to the blackmail. She was she was chief prosecutor, I think, for 8 years. I think it's 8 years. No, it would be maybe 6 years. She was chief prosecutor. She had one case having to do with Gaza, which she systematically, desperately tried to quash in the most shameless, embarrassing, absurd ways. And then she had a second case where she kept kicking the can down the block. And by the time it was time to move to investigate this case, which began in 2015, when it came time to finally investigate the case, she had 3 months left in office. This is courage.
Yeah, I think you are giving away a little bit, which I mean, a lot of the readers of your book would be very surprised who would often hear you speaking because they will think, oh, Norman keeps quoting human rights reports all the time. But your book is about actually being very, very critical about human rights reports, including Amnesty International, which we would discuss. But I want to go a little bit more systematically.
That's an important point.
Yeah, no, we definitely just
I've
dig
spent
deep.
a large part of my life, yes,
Absolutely.
quoting those reports, but an as large part of my life exposing the falsity of those reports.
Absolutely. But before that, I wanted to have a comment on the subjectivity aspect of the book, because you start by saying that um, this story of people of Gaza, even though it's not directly a story of people of Gaza, it has very muted agency. So you say that my book is not about agency because it's people like people in Gaza cannot have that kind of agency. And I think this was one of the remarkable aspects that I found in your book. You did tremendously well in not fetishizing agency, which is sometimes it becomes an academic trend to talk about agency all the time, and at the same time not casting the Palestinians as passive victims. I mean, your discussion about what happens in 2009, but more significantly 2012, these possibilities are opening up. There are things that they are doing. Obviously, there is resistance and stuff like that. So that was one comment, and on the examination part, so that's the comment on martyrdom and subjectivity. And on examination, I think obviously you were examining kind of two aspects. You were examining the blatant Israeli propaganda narrative on one hand, but you are also examining your sources at the same time. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, there's always agency. The question is the limits, the parameters on the agency. If you take the case of the United States, there were slave revolts, but actually there weren't that many. If you consider that the biggest was Nat Turner, and all of 60 white people were killed, and it was all over in 2 days, less than 2 days. It's not exactly a impressive record of slave revolts. And then the question is, how do you explain the lack of those revolts, namely the very limited parameters slaves had to act? And it's a complex question, obviously, how you explain that. But I don't think a true history of African American or true African American history would, at least with regard to the slaves, attribute a large amount of agency to them. No, it's true. There was the Underground Railroad, and there was the abolitionist movement, and all those sorts of things. But the fact of the matter is, within that big picture, the actual amount of agency of the slaves is rather limited, in my opinion. And I think it's the same thing with the situation in Gaza. It was a concentration camp. How much agency do you have in a concentration camp? It's not realistic. So you take the case of the Jews during World War II. There's all sorts of exaggeration about the number of revolt, partisans, as they're called. It's practically nothing. There are reasons for it. Why? I mean, that's always been a big question. Why was there so little resistance to the Nazis? And one of the standard answers is, show me in a country where there was a lot of resistance. There really wasn't much. In the case of France, it was like nobody. The whole notion of the French resistance is a complete fabrication of a people who's given to very large fabrications about themselves, the French. So by and large, these notions of resistance in the face of overwhelming power tend, I think, to be very exaggerated. That Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was very, very limited. Actually, the greatest historian on the subject of the Nazi extermination, Raoul Hilberg, he was very severely criticized for saying the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it was practically nothing. And my mother was very insistent. My mother and father were in Warsaw during the uprising. And she said, we had like 4 guns. What are you talking about? If the Red Army had a very large difficulty defeating the Nazis, what do you expect from Jews who have 4 guns? It's not realistic. It's just fantasy. So I don't think, obviously, Hamas's capabilities have increased over time. I think they're vastly exaggerated even now. If you follow the news, for example, have you read about one single battle in Gaza? Battle, I mean, a battle where one side, the other side, there's no report of a battle. There may be a couple of people, snipers here and there, and they kill 2 or right now it's 7 months, and I think it's 290 soldiers, but I think that includes. Wait, does it include? Yeah, no, it doesn't include. But 290 soldiers in 7 months is not exactly a huge number. So I tend to be skeptical of these kind of Hollywood depictions of resistance and agency. Obviously, you have certain within. I gave the examples of Nelson Mandela and Frederick Douglass, who showed a certain amount of agency. Douglass escaped slavery, and Mandela managed eventually to command the respect even of his jailers. So yeah, there's a certain amount of agency there, but I consider it very limited. The Palestinians couldn't do very much. The Palestinians in Gaza couldn't do very much.
I think one of the overarching or very central point to understand as I read your book is your point about establishing, in fact, re-establishing again and again what you are calling the deterrence capacity. I think it would be like one would misread your book completely or miss a significant part of the main point, because even with your diagnosis and inquest of a lot of the human rights reports and stuff, that is a very central point. So to understand this conflict, this this point is very important insofar as your argument is concerned. So can you tell our viewers, why is it such an important point and what is it?
Well, deterrence capacity or capability, deterrence capacity or capability is just, it's a fancy technical term for instilling the fear in Arabs of Israel, the fear of their military might, the fear of their retaliatory capacities, the fear of their intelligence capabilities, to keep the Arabs in place, to keep them in check. And that has been an overarching theme of the Zionist and then the Israeli history, basically because it goes back to Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of the state of Israel. He never believed that Arabs would accept the state of Israel in their midst. He thought that was an impossibility. And therefore, given that that's an impossibility, there's no possibility of peace agreements between the Arab states and Israel, or let's say permanent peace agreements between the Arab states and Israel. And for him, the biggest fear was always what he called an Egyptian Ataturk would come, I should say an Arab Ataturk would come along, modernize the country, and then become a formidable military deterrent and even at some point aggressor. So you had to keep the Arab world backward. That was a tenet of Zionist policy. And that to me is probably the most significant factor in all of Israel's wars. The fear of looking weak, because they believe the moment they look weak, the Arab world will exploit the moment to eradicate them, because the Arab world will never accept a Jewish state in its midst. That's why it's very, in my opinion, it's very unlikely we're going to find an early conclusion to the current situation. Because the worst catastrophe of Israel on October 7th was that it revealed to the world its fundamental weakness, that here was this high-tech state, cutting-edge technology, cutting-edge surveillance technology, run by the Israeli Übermenschen, these commandos who carry out all of these raids, which seem very impressive. And then come October 7th, and this ragtag army of Untermenschen not only carry out a massacre, that was a concern for sure, an outrage for sure, but that wasn't the only outrage. It was the technical competence that the Hamas displayed. And it quickly transmitted the message throughout the Arab world of, hey, Israel isn't as invincible as we thought it was. Israel isn't as strong as we thought it was. And what follows from that, maybe we have a military option. And that's where the deterrence capability sets in. We have to transmit the message to the Arab world: you don't have a military option. You have to reinstill the fear in the Arab world of ever even contemplating the possibility of defeating us militarily. And sometimes it takes strange forms. For example, Israel suffered a major defeat in 2006 in Lebanon, what Syed Nasrallah called the divine victory. And it was very clear that a critical component of Operation Protective Edge, in beginning December 26, 2008, and ending January 17, 2009, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction. One of the main purposes of Protective Edge was to restore Israel's deterrence capacity after the defeat it suffered in Lebanon in 2006. In other words, it had nothing to do with Gaza. They were trying to restore their deterrence capacity, which had suffered a hit in Lebanon by destroying Gaza, because they weren't ready for a round two with Party of God.
Yeah, I think this is a very good segue into the part two of your book. So, just for our viewers, part one consists of a chapter called Self-Defense, the second chapter is Deterring Arabs and Deterring Peace, then Spin-offs and Human Shields. I think where we are today at this point in time, these two chapters become very obvious. So I'm just skipping them because most of our viewers would know, like things like Human Shields and Spin-offs are essentially, these are propaganda narratives. So I'm jumping to part two, and I think you must tell a little bit about the Goldstone report, but because I think the significance of the Goldstone report, if I read you correctly, is that for the first time, the idea of human right was projected to the talks or public debates about conflicts. I mean, even before that, maybe human rights has always been there, but this is a significant time. You don't use the word hegemony, but one can understand that where a counter hegemony was established, where Israel was taken into account of its terror and violence. And then obviously there is a second part to it. But first, tell us about the significance of the Goldstone report.
Well, it was a very dramatic moment. I think it's forgotten now. Operation Cast Lead was a real horror show. Actually, it's amusing now in retrospect. I wrote a book on Operation Cast Lead. I took the title from an article by Gideon Levy, and the title was "This Time We Went Too Far."
Mm-hmm.
It was believed back then that a new threshold had been crossed, and a threshold so high that was almost unthinkable it could be further crossed. In fact, I'll get back to your point in a moment, but just for the sake of your listeners, Operation Cast Lead was then paled in comparison to Operation Protective Edge. Protective Edge comes in 2014, July 9th to August 26th, 51 days, Operation Protective Edge. And that was thought to be a new uncrossable threshold. The head of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, his name is Peter Maurer, or was Peter Maurer. And he said never in his life had he seen the magnitude of destruction as he saw in Gaza. Well, guess what? The estimate, the estimate is in Operation Protective Edge, there was 2.5 million tons of rubble left behind. Do you know what the current estimate now for Gaza is? 38 million tons of rubble. So each time we cross a threshold that we think can be crossed, and it gets crossed in spectacular ways this time. They estimate it'll take 10 to 15 years just to clear out the rubble from Gaza before you can begin the rebuilding.
And was it somewhere around 300,000 tons or something for cast lead? Around that range?
600,000 for
600,000, right.
In any event, so to get back to that, the first thing to remember is it's forgotten now. Cast lead did provoke a huge international outcry. There were very large demonstrations throughout the world in support of the people of Gaza. And that in turn caused a demand for accountability. Now, the human rights organizations happen to have been excellent after Cast Lead. Amnesty, as I mentioned to you a moment ago, produced a very comprehensive and compelling volume called 22 Days of Death and Destruction. Human Rights Watch put out 7 separate reports on things like Rain of Fire, one was called, on Israel's use of white phosphorus during Cast Lead. Another was called White Flag Killings, about Palestinians who were shot dead holding white flags. Another was on the drone warfare. So they were very good, for sure, after Cast Lead. However, they weren't the turning point. The turning point was the Human Rights Council did something unprecedented. The Human Rights Council is corrupt, even though generally the standards of its mission reports are quite high, in my opinion. They decide to appoint Richard Goldstone, the head of the mission, to investigate what happened during Cast Lead. Now, Richard Goldstone is a South African jurist. He was on one of the international commissions on Yugoslavia, if my memory is correct.
Yes.
Yeah. And what made Goldstone's choice so unusual was 2 things. Number one, he's Jewish. He's a self-identified Zionist. I don't like the term, but he calls himself, so I'll call him a self-identified Zionist. And he was active in many Israel causes. He sat on the board of directors of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So that was one thing that was unusual. The other thing is the Human Rights Council said, look, you can write your own terms of reference. Whatever you want to do in terms of your mission, we will accept. And that put Goldstone in a peculiar position because, as he said later on, I couldn't in good faith turn it down. They were saying I can write my own terms of reference. So he accepted the appointment, and then he and three others, Travers, not so important for our purposes, Desmond Travers, and the other names will come to me.
Who would go on to hold their grounds later.
Yes, they produced an extraordinary report. It was about 400 pages, and it was very, it pulled no punches. It said Israel was attempting to terrorize the Palestinian population. They committed multiple war crimes, plausible crimes against humanity. And it didn't stop at Cast Lead. It described the whole occupation. And it talked about the West Bank. It was very comprehensive and devastating. Well, Richard Goldstone came under a torrent of abuse, vituperation, anger, indignation. Alan Dershowitz, the Harvard Law professor, compared him to Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz. It was very ugly. The chief rabbi in South Africa said that he couldn't attend his grandson's bar mitzvah. So he came under a torrent of abuse, but he held his ground. He held his ground until April 1st, 2011. When we first read it, he had an op-ed in the Washington Post in which he recanted the whole report. And the first reaction was, is this an April Fool's joke? It was April 1st, April Fool's Day. But that was quickly superseded by the reality. Yeah, this thing happened, and it was very devastating. I remember the day it happened. I was absolutely shattered because it was a very powerful weapon. How can you question the bona fides of Richard Goldstone? He's an internationally regarded jurist. He was Jewish. He was a Zionist. What would be his motive for falsifying the record? So I remember I was quite shattered. I was in communication at that point with John Dugard, who currently heads up the South African delegation before the ICJ. Now he's about 87, and he's the one, for those of you listeners who watch the hearings, he's the one person with the red robe in the hearings. And I wrote to him and I said, something just died in me. And he said, me too. Because it was a huge victory. And then it was undone. My own view was he was probably blackmailed because there was nothing in his Washington op-ed that could explain why he did what he did. He claimed there was new information that caused him to reconsider his conclusions, but that was totally untenable. There was no new information. I go through it very carefully in the book, but there's no point in doing that now. I'll just quote you. John Dugard, who I mentioned a moment ago, is also from South Africa. Mm-hmm. He was actually a family attorney for Nelson Mandela's family and also for Bishop Tutu's family. He's an extremely honorable guy. No question about that in my mind. In any event, he wrote in an article in the New Statesman, he wrote, quote, "There are no new facts that exonerate Israel and that could possibly have led Goldstone to change his mind. What made him change his mind, therefore, remains a closely guarded secret." And I think he was blackmailed. That's why I believe the same thing with what happened with Fatou Bensouda. Even though she's completely disreputable, she was a complete crook. The ICC takes people like, at that point, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, was called the International Caucasian Court because it only prosecuted Africans. So it had to change its image. So they got a African to prosecute Africans. They got Fatou Bensouda, and they purposely chose her because she was so corrupt. She had a very notorious reputation in the Gambia, because when she's so corrupt, it's easy to manipulate her. We know the skeletons in your closet. And Israel found the skeletons also. It's not so difficult. In any event, to get back to the point at hand, yeah, it was a real moment of reckoning. My own view is, I already mentioned earlier, I have 2 chapters in the book called Betrayal, which refers to the silence and worse of the human rights community after Operation Protective Edge. And my own view is everybody was afraid of being Goldstoned. That became an expression, to be Goldstoned. They were afraid that Israel would get the goods on them. And as you know, you're old enough. I don't know how old you are, but if you're over 25, you're old enough to know everybody's got skeletons in their closet. And if you don't have skeletons in your closet, your friends do, your relatives do. I actually don't believe Goldstone was blackmailed for something he did, because that would have come out a long time earlier, in my opinion. But his daughter lives in Israel. So tap the phone. She's having an affair. Her husband's having an affair. And you could just imagine the scene of her pleading, "Daddy, please, please do what they say. They're going to destroy me, destroy my family, destroy your grandchild." It's very easy to imagine. I remember talking to Professor Chomsky about this situation, and then he began to publicly say, you can't really blame Goldstone, because when you're under those sorts of pressures, he was a family man, Professor Chomsky, and his wife, his children, his grandchildren. And I'm sure in his own mind's eye, he thought, well, if the same thing was done to me and my wife or my kids begged me, I'd probably do it. So there was another betrayal in April 26th, by the former president of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, Joan Donoghue, because it was like Goldstone. We thought we had a big victory when the court declared that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. And then she went on this BBC program, Hard Talk, and she said, we never concluded that. But in her
It's
case,
a Goldstone moment.
Yeah, it was it was very coincidental. It was both in August, April. Both occurred in April. Goldstone was April 1st. She was April 26th. As Eliot said, the cruelest month, April, and it was a cruel month. They both went around their peers. Goldstone never told the 3 other members of his mission that he was going to do it. She never told anybody in the court what she was going to do. She just went on the BBC and rescinded the whole ICJ proceeding conclusions. But in her case, it wasn't blackmail, it was pure careerism. Nobody put a gun to her head. It's just that she's no longer president of the court. She's looking for a job.
Yeah, I want to actually move to very quickly the Operation Pillar of Defense, and just to refresh the timeline for our viewers. 2006, the Second Lebanon War, Israel gets a bloody nose, its deterrence capacity is under challenge. 2008, when President Obama, I think it was November 4th or something, where Obama was being sworn in. There are these uh,
They break the
cross-border.
ceasefire.
Yeah.
There was a ceasefire signed in June, and they provoked a break. That to me is an important point for the current situation, because as you know, a critical part of the negotiations between Hamas and Israel is this whole issue of a ceasefire.
Mhm.
And in its current uh, iteration, I'm speaking now today, but you'll explain to your viewers because it could change tomorrow. They're talking about a 6-month ceasefire and then negotiations. And I don't believe there are easy alternatives to that formula, but I can't see how it could possibly work. Because the moment the hostages are returned, Israel always breaks ceasefires. It figures ways to provoke a break in the ceasefire. It'll assassinate some Hamas leader. It'll eventually find out where Sinwar is, assassinate some Hamas leader, and then it'll have the pretext to go in again, but this time without any hostages to worry about. So if you look at the history, the ceasefires are utterly meaningless if it's intended that they're going to last. If you take Lebanon in 1982, there was a ceasefire that began in January. Excuse me, I shouldn't talk so fast. There was a ceasefire that began in July 1981, and Israel used the ceasefire to prepare for an attack on Lebanon. And then come May 1982, they began provoking and provoking and provoking until finally the PLO had to react, and they went into Lebanon. And same thing with June 2008. There's a ceasefire. Israel prepares for the attack on Lebanon, the attack on Gaza, and then they provoke they provoke
Cost-led. They provoke response
they
and then
provoke
cost-led.
Hamas. They provoke a
Yeah.
response from Hamas. So I don't see how you could stop them. The only possibility I could see is if you have separating them an international peacekeeping force, which at least can monitor the situation and say who's responsible, even though those never really work either. Israel is quite effective at drowning out the findings of the peacekeeping forces when it wants to. So I'm very skeptical of this notion of a ceasefire.
Yeah, so cost-led happens. The Goldstone report comes in. Israel loses a lot of its legitimacy. Later on, it's recanted, but it seems like from 2009 to even Pillar of Defense 2012, there is some sort of opening going on. More journalists moved into Gaza. There's the Arab Spring, then Wake Up 2012 that happens, and the interesting thing that I found in your discussion on the Pillar of Defense is that when there are regional support, significantly Egypt, but one can think about Turkey and so on. Even a lot of people are now talking about Jordan and so on. Israel cannot act with the impunity that it acts. And your discussion on Pillar of Defense, which is relatively shorter, is a sort of testimony to that. So tell us a little bit about why Pillar of Defense was so unsuccessful as far as Israel was concerned.
Well, first of all, it's an interesting moment because Morsi is in power, the Muslim Brotherhood is in power in Egypt, and
And Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization for our viewers.
an offshoot, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were getting a lot of support. They were getting financial support from Qatar. They were getting diplomatic support. And that's not supposed to happen. You see, this is supposed to be a terrorist organization that cheats its people, steals all the money and all of that. But in fact, it was temporary, as Sarah Roy has pointed out. It was temporary, and it was built based on a housing boom. But actually, the economy wasn't doing very badly at that moment. In fact, many people in the West Bank envied the standard of living in Gaza because things were falling into place. And even on a not on a personal, but on a humanist note, Professor Chomsky goes to Gaza and he gives lectures at Gaza University. It was an optimistic moment. And for Israel, that's a total disaster because that's going to give Hamas legitimacy. And it will make Hamas an interlocutor in any peace negotiations.
And a lot of journalists through the Egyptian border into Gaza,
Yes. Uh,
American.
um, so it had to be stopped. But it was a relatively limited operation because both the Egyptians and the Turks, both Egyptian and Egypt and Turkey said, we're not going to let you do another cast lead. And the United States at that point under Obama was hoping to cultivate relations with Egypt and Turkey. And so it transmitted the message to Israel that this has to stop.
And Turkey already have the Maui Marmara incident that you discuss in your book,
Yes.
in your part 3.
Actually, I discussed Mavi Marmara at great length because you see, that's what happens when you even have a medium amount of power. Turkey was not going to let that incident pass. And so there was a huge number of reports that came out, and that's my sort of métier, analyzing these reports. So it was, even though I don't like to use the word only, but I'll use it strictly relatively speaking, only 10 people were killed aboard the Mavi Marmara. It nonetheless created an international, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but certainly an international scene that had to be accommodated. And so there were, Ban Ki-moon appointed this commission to investigate what was happening. It was a complete joke. The person who basically headed up the commission, it was formerly a New Zealander, but it was this guy, Alvaro Uribe from Colombia, who's probably one of the biggest murderers and crooks on God's earth. Perfect choice by Ban Ki-moon. And he wrote a completely fraudulent report. But because Turkey had the clout, they had to address it. And
So come back to pillar of defense. There is Turkey, there is Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, more American journalist, Professor Chomsky makes this visit. Wrap up that pillar of defense.
yes, so it was over relatively quickly. And the number of people killed by the standards of Israel's high-tech murder sprees, the number of people killed was on the low end. I can't remember, it was the double or the triple digits right now. And then things went quickly from bad to worse because the Muslim Brotherhood was overthrown. And then Sisi came to power. He closed the whole tunnel economy that was at that point connecting Hamas with the outside world. And the situation was already abysmal, but then it turned radically worse when Hamas won the election in January 2006. And let me just get the dates right. Pillar of Defense is 2012. So what happened was there was a relaxation in the economy. Yeah, now I remember. I have to just get the dates clear in my mind. After the Mavi Marmara incident, all the international leaders said this situation is unsustainable. This situation is unsustainable. So there was some relaxation of the blockade on Gaza. But then, after the Muslim Brotherhood was defeated, the blockade, it was tightened even more because the tunnel economy. For those of you who don't know, they had developed a very sophisticated tunnel system between Gaza and Egypt. They were smuggling in horses. It was very funny. I mean, it was huge tunnels. Cars were smuggled in through the tunnels, automobiles. So once that was shut down, the situation radically deteriorated in Gaza. And then in 2012, and then in 2014, I'm not going to go through the background because there it's a little bit more complicated what happened. But in 2014, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge, which was, I remember the scenes, the descriptions of what was going on were, as I say, they pale in comparison to what happened after October 7th. But it was quite horrible. It was 2,200 people killed, 550 children, 18,000 homes destroyed.
203 mosques.
Yeah, it was horrible. But even you take the homes, at that point, 18,000 seemed astronomical. And now the current figure, according to the World Bank, for Gaza is 300,000. So we're talking about a totally different magnitude. And after Operation Cast Lead, the population was so shattered by just the sheer density and intensity of the Israeli assault that the prospect of armed resistance seemed very remote. And so the next thing they tried was nonviolent civil resistance, the
Yeah.
Great March of Return, which is not in the book.
Yeah, hold on a little bit because I think, yeah, that chapter, I want to discuss the two reports that you discussed because just for our viewers, 2014 Protective Edge happens, and this is the moment where things now starts going downhill, right? And what you argue in your book is that you accuse Amnesty International and also UN Human Rights Council reports. So they played a big part. I mean, in sort of the downward trend that started. Obviously, these are long chapters that you have written. You have gone into the most micro detail that's possible, including things like, oh, how many Palestinian NGO organizations they took into account when they were looking into the reports, and how many Israeli reports they took into account. But I think I wanted to flag two things that essentially I figured out as the sort of big.
I'd like to make a few comments because, first of all, I don't think, not because of any intention, but I don't think you gave the full picture.
Mhm.
With Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Desmond Travers told me the estimate was there were 300 human rights reports on Cast Lead. In the case of Protective Edge, there was almost nothing. Human Rights Watch, which produced 7 reports on caste lead, it produced one nothing report on attacks on schools when everybody already agreed it was attacking schools. It was like 12 pages, and that was it. Everybody sat it out. And as I said, my speculation was it was fear. So Amnesty International was put in a peculiar position. You see, because in the human rights community, everybody's watching the other's back. So if you take, for example, the recent reports on Israeli apartheid, the first report is by B'Tselem, says Israel is an apartheid state. That's quickly followed by a report by Human Rights Watch, Israel is an apartheid state, which is then quickly followed by a report by Amnesty, Israel is an apartheid state. And you see that pattern all the time. They're watching out for each other. That if you're going to go out on the limb, we'll go out with you. But this didn't happen this time. So Amnesty got very scared because it was going out on the limb on its own. And so it produced this horrible report. Horrible, horrible, horrible. I was so enraged by what they did. Human Rights Watch sat it out. And then they appointed this American judge from New York. The UN appointed this American judge. What was her name? Mary. What was her name? Mary. 1 second. It slips my mind. I think she was Irish. Mary. 305. Yeah, I'll find it in a moment. Mary McGowan Davis, yeah. The point is, and you knew the moment they appoint an American judge, we know it's going to be a disaster. And of course, I said at the time it would be a disaster, and it was a disaster. So they all wrote, I should say not they all, it was really only 2 major reports on protective edge. But there's another interesting side note, because the history in itself is interesting, but it's always interesting to also compare it to the present. One of the interesting phenomena from since October 7th is that the human rights community has been almost completely effaced. There are a couple of statements by Human Rights Watch and a couple of statements by Amnesty, but really nothing significant. It all came from the internal UN system.
Yeah, the UNRWA.
Well, it was everyone, World Health Organization, World Food Program, UNESCO, UNICEF,
WHO even.
WHO. It was a very interesting thing that happened, which is actually a hopeful sign that the whole UN system aligned itself with the people of Gaza. And they became very aggressive in their statements, be it, we left out, of course, the most important, UNRWA, the statements by Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, the statements by all of those organizations. It was a deeply moving sight to behold that they finally found their backbone. You usually use those reports from those organizations, you use them just for numbers, infant mortality, things like that. You want the figures. You never use them as political documents. And so this time, if you, for example, look at the South African application to the International Court of Justice, it contains literally hundreds of footnotes, and each footnote often has 10 and 15 references. And interestingly, there's an occasional reference to an Amnesty report or a Human Rights Watch report, but that's no longer the case. In general, it's all the UN agencies. And I thought that was a very hopeful sign. As I said, they finally found their spine, they finally found their backbone, and they were just pulling no punches the past 7 months. And they have proven to be a very formidable force that Israel has a lot of difficulty responding to. So if you look at, for example, the last provisional measures of the court, the ones issued on May 24th, the core of the that particular moment, it was the fourth time South Africa went to the court asking for provisional measures. The core was who to believe. The international agencies, the whole UN system, the entire UN system says we're facing a catastrophe, a disaster, apocalyptic conditions. There are no words to describe what's going on in Gaza. On the other side is Israel saying there's no catastrophe, there's no disaster, there are a few kinks, but no big problems. And the court had to decide who to believe. And they say, we believe the agencies. We believe the agencies. So for me, I find it morally uplifting that these, so to speak, bureaucrats in all of these organizations finally saw the humanity of their subjects and not just doing bookkeeping on inanimate objects, but a people that's being martyred. And they found the courage to come what may, Philippe Lazzarini, they were out to get him, including the Germans, probably especially the Germans, because they're all Nazis. They were out to get Lazzarini. We didn't stop him. That's a credit. And you know what was an interesting reaction by me? My reaction was, I'm so glad because I don't have to do that work now. It's all been done. It's all been documented. Normally, that's what I would do. I would go through the human rights reports to try to present an accurate depiction. And I thought to myself, thank God I've been rendered superfluous. It's been done. All you have to do is look at any of the reports coming from any of the compendia coming from South Africa or any of the agencies or anybody who compiles, and you have the whole picture.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up two things. I mean, obviously, no one can do it justice on these two massive chapters where you take on Amnesty International and UN Human Rights Council reports. But I think to do some justice, I wanted to pick up on 2 points, which I think kind of the bigger picture on what you were saying. So I think two essential point was that one, both Amnesty International and Human Rights Council did the mistake of treating the point that we discussed earlier, the deterrence capacity, treating Israel's response in protective edge as a military response. So that's one point they did a mistake on, where maybe they didn't need Norman Finkelstein. And the second point, I think the big point that you were making is that kind of the balancing approach that these human rights organizations did, that, oh, here is violence in this case, there is violence in that case, and so both are complicit in war crimes. What you are saying is that that's not possible where the asymmetry is large. And there is a table I would plug in. I mean, my producer would obviously screenshot it. It's in page number 311, where you give this sort of ratio. And you're saying that this ratio of killing, of destruction is so high. And the kind of spaces that Amnesty International and Human Rights Councils gives is like in the ratio of 3:4, while the destruction are in the ratio like hundreds, sometimes thousands. And so these were the two big points I think that came out of these two chapters for me. One treating it as protective as is a military operation, the other is the asymmetry. So elaborate a little bit on that, because I think that was a very, very powerful point you made through very
Oh,
rigorous um, eh, um, analysis of the two reports.
Well, I'll make it again, I'll try to make it current, but it makes the same point. Immediately after October 7th, Israel won 99% of the propaganda war, 99% beginning October 8th, because every single media outlet, bar none, used the headline Israel-Hamas war. It was an Israel-Hamas war. Namely, it was a war to inflict a defeat on Hamas. And the first attempt, unsuccessful, to recast what was actually happening was what South Africa did with its application. This isn't an Israel-Hamas war. This is a war against the people of Gaza. This is a genocide. It's not a war. It's a genocide. It's something very different. Now, I will acknowledge, because I don't want to be dogmatic about these things, yes, it had a component. It wanted to inflict a military defeat on Hamas, and also it wanted to get back the hostages. I'm not going to dispute that. But that was only a part of the picture. The big picture was that we are determined to once and for all put an end to this Gaza question. This Gaza thing has to end. As I quote at the very end of the book, I quote from 2015, I quote an Israeli official as saying, let's just get the exact quote. One second.
Just tell us also the page number so that you can flash the quotation.
Okay. Here, at the very end of the book, I say, I quote, a senior Israeli official is saying, another war with Gaza is inevitable. We cannot conduct a constant war of attrition. Therefore, the next conflict has to be the last conflict. And that's exactly what happened. That they said we can't keep going in and mowing the lawn. So they now were not going to mow the lawn. They were going to extirpate every one of the 2.1 million blades of grass in Gaza. So in their minds, to defeat Hamas permanently, to put an end to this, we have to destroy Gaza. We have to put an end to it. And so if you treat it as our press treated it, and as the human rights reports treated after Operation Protective Edge, as a military, as a war, you miss what's going on. Yes, that's an element. I'm not going to deny that. But there was also the element back then of restoring our deterrence capacity, putting the Palestinians in their place, trying to prevent them from getting too uppity. And so that involved massive death and destruction that had nothing to do with the actual military aim, the systematic death and destruction. Actually, the Goldstone report was very good on that. The Goldstone report was the first report to actually capture that. So let's see if I can just find it. Just give me half a moment because it's worth quoting. Here, this is what the Goldstone report said about Operation Cast Lead. It concluded that the Israeli assault constituted a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. That was what the real aim was. And when you cast it as a military confrontation strictly, you're missing the point that actually it was the assault was targeting the civilian population to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. Yeah. So that's never stated in those human rights reports that came after Operation Protective Edge. And everybody treated it as if it were just a conventional war between two sides. And that was the great lie, what you might call the foundational lie of post-October 7th. And that lie, they tried to shatter, South Africa tried to shatter it. I don't think it was very successful because the media still continued to call it a Israel-Hamas war. Every single article begins that way. Israel-Hamas war.
Yeah, so we are coming to an end, but I still want a little bit of time. I think I want to go back. So yeah, this is the last chapter, Betrayal 2, UN Human Rights Council. Betrayal 1 was the preceding penultimate chapter, Amnesty International, and then a conclusion to which I'll come to. But I want to actually sort of round up this by going to the first chapter, in fact, which is the self-defense. And what I thought is that there are three aspects. One is the moral aspect of self-defense, which is like whether people of Palestine or Hamas has the right to resist, which is like an unambiguous yes. Then there's the legal aspect where people under occupation can have the right to resist through arms, which I think is also an unambiguous yes. But I wanted to ask you about the third aspect, which is the political prudence or the strategic aspect. And I think that relates to where you end the book in a way, where you call for a kind of because your diagnosis is that here is the sort of world's most powerful military machine, one of the world's most powerful military machine, and there is Hamas, which is not even a kind of proper army. They can defeat them militarily. So the way out is, and that's probably also tells a lot about your interest in Gandhi, to some extent, maybe Professor Chomsky. You call for a mass sort of mobilization with support and so on and so forth. So I think the question that comes to many people's mind, also keeping in mind the October 7 incident, um, how do you evaluate the political prudence of a military resistance by people of Palestine against Israel?
Well, there are two questions, there are several questions there, and I think we're going to leave it off at these several questions because otherwise you will bear witness to my demise. Maybe you would like that, so you'll get a lot of, it'll go viral, especially among Zionists. But I would prefer to.
we might get more views than Lex Friedman in that case. If you die, you know.
Uh, there's a legal issue of the right to self-defense, on the right to use armed force, and there is there's also a moral question. And let's say if you take the case of what happened in October 7th, one of the standard questions is, what did you expect Israel to do? What could it have done? And I will acknowledge that they had a legal right to self-defense. I don't think that's a difficult question to answer, because Hamas continued to fire rockets in Israel, and Hamas kept hostages. So legally, they had a right to self-defense. Israel, in this case, not Hamas. Israel had a right to self-defense. But in my opinion, there's a difference between a legal right and a moral right. So what do I mean by that? Let's take the case of a husband who batters his wife, and he batters her for 20 years, okay? And she's screaming and yelling, and nobody does anything. She calls the police. The police say it's a domestic dispute. We're not going to interfere, which was typical when I was growing up. That was, was the adage, a man's home is his castle, and cops didn't interfere. It's a domestic dispute. And then finally, this woman, in a fit of desperation, she picks up a kitchen knife, and she charges headlong to her husband. He has a gun handy, and he shoots her dead. Now, in a court of law, he would probably be acquitted, even if all the description of what he had done to her, because technically his life was in danger. He had a right of self-defense. But my view is he forfeited that right by what he did to that woman for 20 years. Maybe legally he had that right, but morally he forfeited that right. He had no right to kill her. She had the right to live. He forfeited that right of self-defense. And I believe the same thing is true with the people of Gaza. Israel, yes, legally had a right of self-defense. Did it have the right to go in? No, in my opinion, it forfeited that right after what it had done to the people of Gaza for 20 years. So that's one aspect of your question. The second aspect of your question, I'm going to just tell you frankly, I was wrong. There wasn't a nonviolent option. It was tested on March 30th, 2018, the Great March of Return. It was nonviolent, overwhelmingly nonviolent for the first 6 weeks, from March 30th to May 14th, when Israel committed a massacre, and then things began to deteriorate. The whole world ignored it. Even the Palestine Solidarity Movement totally ignored it. They didn't have a nonviolent option. I was wrong. I thought it would work. In fact, I was in touch with people there, and I was one of the people encouraging it, and I was very embarrassed how it ended. It revealed my naivete and not just my fallibility, which everybody's fallible. It revealed my naivete. It was completely ignored. It had no nonviolent option, and nobody will ever convince me otherwise. In reaction to that nonviolent resistance, according to a UN mission, they put out a 250-page report, single-spaced, 250-page report. What did it find? It found that Israel, the snipers, they had among their best snipers lined up along the perimeter fence with Gaza. The snipers were targeting children. The snipers were targeting journalists, medics. They were even targeting disabled people, double amputees, 300 meters from the perimeter fence.
Is this the point on which you call someone a moron?
No, that was another, well, I called that person a moron many times. Actually, at every opportunity that availed me, I couldn't resist
Sorry for the distraction.
I couldn't resist the reality check. So they didn't have a nonviolent option, and that's why I feel that before you render judgment on anybody, be it Putin in February 2022 or Hamas on October 6th, before you render a judgment, a legal judgment, okay, legal judgments are beyond our control, but before you render a moral judgment, you have to show me options. What option did Putin fail to exploit? I'm curious. I don't know of any. I don't know of any option. I know he desperately sought, not just him, the whole Soviet leadership from 1990
Mhm.
was desperately seeking, or 1991, was desperately seeking some resolution of this issue with NATO. Um, so you couldn't appease the West. There was no way. They were determined as they're lining up their chess pieces for the war with China. They were determined to uh, uh, humble is not the right word. They were determined to uh, neutralize Russia in preparation for this confrontation they're preparing with China. There was nothing they could do. And then it's the same thing with the people of Gaza. What were they supposed to do? On October 6th, Gaza was a dead issue, dead as a doornail. I know because I quit. I stopped writing on Gaza in 2020.
We had a show with you prior to this where, the tone and tenor was very, very, uh, I don't know if we should use the word pessimistic, but there was significant tone of helplessness in your voice.
Yeah, I was embarrassed. I had given up. I had always said I'm not a quitter, but this time I quit. First time ever, because I couldn't see any way out. Um, and that was the moment when it looked like there was going to be a deal with Saudi Arabia. Everything was going to be done over the heads of the people of Gaza, and it would be everyone lives happily ever after, and the people of Gaza would be left to languish and die in the concentration camp. So whether it was prudent what they did in October 6th, I don't know, and it's not for me to decide. It's for the people of Gaza to decide whether it was worth
Mhm.
it. That throw of the dice. As Muin Rabbani, my colleague and comrade, says, the main purpose of October 6th was to shatter the status quo. October 7th is to shatter the status quo, that this can't go on. Now, as to what ensued, I'm not passing judgment. 40,000 people are dead. There, but for the grace of God, go I. So I'm not going to be glib and say it was worth it. That's not going to happen. I'm not doing that. But on the other hand, I think it's within the right of the people of Gaza to decide whether it was worth it. Were crimes committed on October 6th? Sure. I'm not going to October 7th. My mind is now going.
October 7th, yeah.
I have so many dates in my head at this point. I'm losing track of everything. I'm not going to deny horrific things happened October 7th, but if you look at the abolitionists after the slave revolts, they never condemned the slaves for what they did. They just did not. They said what happened was horrible,
Mhm.
but they never blamed them. I mean, well, how could you blame a slave? A slave is somebody who from birth to death is condemned to servitude. And if they decide they're not going to accept that servitude and whatever crazy thing they do, if it's crazy, I don't know if it's crazy, but whatever they do, I'm not going to condemn them. I'll say, hey, beheading babies, and here I'm referring to not Turner, not to Hamas. Beheading babies, not a nice thing, but I'm not going to condemn them. And that's not because I'm, a radical pose. I'm not woke, but I feel the same position as the abolitionists. See, the difference between me and everybody else is, in the case of the abolitionists, they saw the slaves every day of their lives. They saw the slave auctions. They knew about the humiliations and rapings of the women. Everybody knew. They saw the humiliation, degradation of a slave every day. So they didn't have it in them to condemn the slaves when there was the revolt or revolts. And with me, I knew Gaza before October 7th. I spent 15 years going through those human rights reports. That's basically what I did for 15 years of my life. So if you were as close to the material as I was, you would be as reluctant as I was to condemn them. I know what happened to those people.
To let
So
you,
I don't address the prudence because I don't believe they had any options.
Mhm.
October 7th was a throw of the dice, and it's for the people of Gaza to decide whether it was worth it.
Totally fair. To let you go with this parting, on a lighter note, if I was your student in one of your political science classes, how much mark or grade would you give me in terms of my reading of your book? Of course, there would be a grade back to the extent that I read your book way too late. But what would be that grade?
Well, first of all, I'm going to be honest with you. And I don't mean this in any way, demeaning way to my students. I don't assign books anymore. Nobody reads. I don't even bother. Uh, People think a tweet is an argument. People believe that. They think a tweet is an argument. There's no concept of what an argument is. The construction of an argument is so tough. It's so mentally exhausting to construct an argument. The human mind, a normal human mind, I'm not being a Professor Chomsky, a human mind can construct an argument maybe of a paragraph in length. But anything more than a paragraph, you have to work it out on paper in order to see how things flow. There was the great Indian mathematician Ramanujan. And what they said was the most remarkable thing about him is he was able to skip 1,000 steps. He just could go from there to there and didn't have to work all that out to get there. But most people, they have to work it out on paper, go from step to step to step to step to step. So they don't read. I just assume they don't read, and I go over the material in class. So the fact that you read the book, though I'm dubious you read the last 2 chapters because they're so tough. I had to reread the book, after October 7th because I had forgotten a lot. The book came out in 2018, and I needed to, as it were, arm myself for the battles ahead. And I was amazed at the level of detail and the complexity of the argument. I think it's a great book. I don't care what anyone says. The mental investment, most authors, Professor Chomsky said, most historians are good clerks. They go through archives, and then what do? They arrange the material logically, what's called nowadays a narrative. There is no such thing as that in this book. Every paragraph has an argument, worked out, trying to make sense of what's going on here. It wasn't a labor of love, it was a labor of anger.
You write this in your preface or introduction. Yeah, it wasn't a labor of love to
I was
complete this book.
so angry at the lies. Right now I'm writing something on Joan Donahue, the ICJ president who claimed they didn't find Israel as plausibly. It's so hard. It's so, because a lot of the legal language is so purposely opaque so as to pretend that they're doing something profound, which they're not. So trying to work it through, you know. And I struggle because no, she's not going to get away with it. And I do believe, I mean, this may sound like hubris again. I don't believe anybody else will ever do what I did. Do you know every report I read, I had to read at least 3 times?
Yeah, I can totally imagine that.
The first time you read it to see where the argument is going. That's the first reading. Second reading is you're looking for what are the gaps in the argument. Now I know where it's going to. Now that I know where it's going to end, let me see what doesn't work. And the third reading is, did I get it right? Or did I miss some of the arguments that I thought were gaps? So I didn't have to check if I got it right. So everything I read over the last 15 years, I read at least 3 times. The fourth time would be the fact check time. But by the end, I start to get people on the web who are supportive of me to do the fact checking because it was becoming mentally impossible anymore. I just couldn't do it anymore. And now it's harder and harder and harder and harder. But it's an enormous mental effort, I can assure you.
Thanks for writing this book, and also thanks for this discussion. I think a lot of people like to consume things in video format these days. I, of course, assume I get a view for the discussion and the reading, but it's too late there, and I'd like to let you go.
Well, I'm going
Hi,
to give.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.